Part 17. I Can See the Laws of Things. Author, Yitiao Xuanhuan. Chapter 161. In an instant, Ji Wudao's expression changed drastically. He instantly felt a huge repulsive force coming from Lin An's body, and all his strength was suddenly swept back at that moment. Under the huge repulsive force, his body flew backwards and hit the high wall heavily. Dao Yi, who fell to the ground, looked blankly at Lin An standing in front of him and said, "Lin, instructor." Lin An moved his wrist indifferently and said, "No matter how many people you kill, I can ignore it, but that's your fault. If you dare to touch my student's head, then you are slapping me in the face. I will let you know today what kind of fate will happen to those who fall into my hands, Lin An." Ji Wudao gritted his teeth, stood up, wiped away the blood from the corner of his mouth, stared at Lin An, and said, "Who are you anyway?" Lin An said indifferently, "You don't need to know who I am, you just need to know that I am very angry now and you will die soon." In an instant, Lin An suddenly stretched out his hand in the direction of Ji Wudao, and wheels of law formed one after another in his eyes. The surrounding ground instantly exploded with hard thorns one after another, stabbing straight towards Ji Wudao. Ji Wudao roared angrily, rose into the sky, and said, "You dare to be on par with the sky, I will kill you here today." The next moment, he roared and waved his hand, and tens of millions of sword blades suddenly turned into a ferocious dragon, rushing towards Lin An. The sword blades kept rubbing against each other, making a sharp sound that was enough to penetrate the eardrums. Dao Yi suddenly stood up gritting his teeth and shouted, "Instructor Lin An, be careful." Lin An did not retreat at all. He strode forward with a gloomy face, suddenly waved his hand to the long sword dragon, and shouted, "Get away." Ji Wudao's expression suddenly changed, and he saw that the 10,000-meter sword dragon exploded into a rain of swords all over the sky under Lin An's loud shout. If you look under the eyes of the law, you can clearly see that a new and terrifying will of law has been artificially added to the system of laws that constitutes each blade. Explode. That's right, just like the method Lin An used to deal with Dao Yi at that time, he directly constructed the wheels of law inside the flying swords they controlled and destroyed them from the inside out. And now Lin An is no longer comparable to Jiangdu. After he absorbed the souls of thousands of great masters and generals, his mental power soared crazily during this period. I'm afraid even he himself doesn't know how terrifying his power has reached now. Because he has been able to easily build the will of rules among these hundreds of thousands of sword blades, which is beyond the reach of extraordinary powers. The next moment, in the rain of swords exploding all over the sky, Lin An rose into the sky. Ji Wudao could even clearly see the gloomy expression on Lin An's face. Click. A bolt of lightning fell from the sky and Lin An caught it in his hand. In Ji Wudao's horrified eyes, the lightning passed directly through a distance of several hundred meters and fell heavily on him. The shrill screams instantly echoed throughout the world. "Yellow-mouthed kid, how dare you hurt me? When we meet again tomorrow, I will take your life." Ji Wudao, who was struck by lightning, screamed miserably. With his hair disheveled, he turned around decisively and flew towards the mountains. Lin An said solemnly, "Do you want to escape?" The next moment, the strong wind blew up Lin An's hair. He suddenly stretched out his hand in the direction of Ji Wudao's escape. Purple light burst out in his eyes and he shouted, "Come here." For a moment, Ban Meng and Dao Yi were shocked to see it. In the direction where Lin An's hand stretched out, the gravity was actually distorted. Under his tug, the peaks of hundreds of green mountains were tilted directly towards him by 45 degrees. Even the dark clouds in the sky were pulled by him and surged directly in his direction. Ji Wudao was even more horrified to find that he seemed to be restrained by an invisible force. His forward speed was instantly curbed, and his whole body moved towards Lin An uncontrollably. Dao Yi trembled. What kind of power is this?" Ban Men said calmly, "Gravity, Lin En has been learning to further control gravity in the past 2 weeks. He can now easily control the gravity and repulsion of everything in the world through laws. His power is now so powerful that I can't even imagine it. Dao Yi looked at the figure blankly, unable to say a word. Ji Wuodao looked at his body moving backward in horror. Those cruel purple eyes were like black holes, bringing huge pulling power. Who is he? How come you have such great power at such a young age? Ji Wuodao suddenly turned his head, looked at Lin En fiercely, and said, "Don't think you can kill me, I will remember you." In an instant, he once again controlled the exploding sword rain, causing them to disperse and shoot towards Lin En. Then he suddenly bit his finger, quickly drew an inscription in the air, and gritted his teeth and said, "Blood escape." The next moment, his body disappeared in a burst of blood mist. Dao Yi stood up suddenly and said, "He ran away." "Chief Lin En." Lin En said expressionlessly, "If you want to run away, let me see where you go." Lin En waved his hand suddenly, and the rain of swords fell directly on the ground like raindrops under the huge gravity. The next moment, the rain of swords all over the sky gathered together and turned into a fierce sword blade. With a sword cry, it stabbed heavily on the ground. I saw 2 words engraved on the blade that were completely out of this era, exuding a strong Taoist rhyme. Dao Yi's expression changed and he said, "The 9th rank spiritual weapon in the final stage of the fairy spirit. The black and yellow mother sword." The Xuanhuan mother sword, in their time, was an unparalleled fairy sword. Its power lies in its ability to divide infinitely. It is said that Tao gives birth to 1, 1 gives birth to 2, 2 and 3 gives rise to all things. This sword represents this variable. As long as the user's power is strong enough, this sword can even be transformed into hundreds of billions, trillions, or even endless numbers. Even most of the fairy swords at that time were based on this sword, but none of them had the power of this sword. And this sword is actually in Ji Wuodao's hand. Dao Yi gritted his teeth, suddenly pulled out the sword blade, and said, "I will keep it for Commander Lin En for the time being. No matter what, this sword must never return to Ji Wuodao's hands." The next moment, Lin flew straight into the sky. He stood in the strong wind and suddenly opened his eyes of law. That Ji Wuodao obviously didn't use the secret techniques of this era, and was elusive. But as long as you are in this era, as long as you are in this world, you will be bound by the laws of all things. The next moment, from Lin En's perspective, a will of law slowly appeared at the place where Ji Wuodao disappeared. Space jump. All things go to the same place, and as long as they are teleported, their source is space. Lin instantly remembered the will of rules in his heart, and then reconstructed it in his eyes. "Want to run?" Lin shouted. He suddenly tore open the space and teleported away directly along the trajectory of Ji Wuodao's disappearance. Banmen raised his head, the power of space flashed in his eyes, and said calmly, "Let's go, I'll plant a space mark on Lin's hand, let's follow." Dao Yi turned his head and glanced at the cold body lying on the ground again, gritted his teeth and said, "Good. I can see the laws of things." Author, Yi Tiao Xianyue. Chapter 162. Qing Cheng. People were coming and going on the streets. This city located in the heart of Zhou had not suffered from war for a long time. The mayor of Qingcheng was sitting in the courtyard of the government hall, chatting and laughing with a few friends. But the next moment, they suddenly felt a huge aura coming from the sky. Their faces changed, and they suddenly raised their heads to look at the sky in the city center. Gods, what is that? The sky above the city center suddenly cracked. An old man covered in blood mist fell out of the hole, and he suddenly spit out a mouthful of blood, and his body fell heavily to the ground uncontrollably. And the next moment, an expressionless young man appeared in the sky. He rushed towards the old man covered in blood mist without any hesitation. The face of the Lord of Qingcheng City changed drastically, and he said, Did you see it clearly? Several friends around him said solemnly, I saw it clearly. The old man's strength is very terrifying. He is at least a high-level town general. Ching Cheng City suddenly raised his head, stared at the sky, and said, what about that young man? The friends around him said solemnly, we don't know, but obviously, his strength is even more terrifying. The sudden change in the city center made everyone in the square scream in fear. People fled everywhere, looking at the old man who fell from the sky and hit the ground heavily. Boom! With a loud bang, a figure suddenly fell from the sky, and a huge gap of more than 10 meters was instantly blown up on the ground. Lin En walked out of the dust slowly, and cars floated behind him one after another. He walked towards Ji Wudao indifferently and said, still want to escape? Ji Wudao was covered in blood. He gritted his teeth and stared at Lin En. You devil! Lin En said indifferently, it's a pity that Ban Meng and I came to you with good intentions, but I didn't expect that the old servant who followed Ban Meng's mother would be a lunatic. Ji Wudao gritted his teeth and sneered, madman? That's right, I am a lunatic. After the mistress was killed by you, I was already crazy. We used to treat your arrow with good intentions, but how did you treat us? He stood up with a roar, and a ray of divine light burst out from his sleeves, and he went straight to Lin En. Before the power of my mistress and I weakened, you regarded us as gods. At the beginning of the spiritual energy recovery, you begged and cried, wanting to seek our protection. You wanted us to give you the power to protect yourself and let you fight against the beast that swept the whole world. Boom! Boom! One after another, the divine light was directly wiped out by Lin En. Ji Wudao was like crazy, constantly launching more fierce attacks on Lin En. He roared, in order to save your era, my kind mistress combined the law of my world and used the secret law created thousands of years ago as a blueprint. She spent countless efforts to let you have the capital to awaken the will of life, but what about you? In an instant, a divine light suddenly broke through Lin En's defense, and instantly passed along Lin En's cheek, cutting off one of his hair. Ji Wudao's eyes were scarlet, and the frequency of his attacks was getting faster and faster. Not only are you ungrateful, but after we were restricted by this world and our power was greatly reduced, you launched a vicious hunt against us. I have never seen a human race like you, you lowly and corrupt reptiles. How dare you call yourself a human race? He roared, and rays of divine light fell from the sky, suppressing Lin En. Boom! A loud noise. In the rolling dust, Lin En walked out with a gloomy face. You mean, you created? Lin En said solemnly, the first savior of this era. Ji Wudao's eyes were red, and he said, why, you didn't expect it? Do you really think that you, the uncivilized people who have never been exposed to spiritual energy from ancient times to the present, can really rely on your own strength to create this miraculous cultivation system? Clang! Ji Wudao's sword blade transformed by divine light collided heavily with the thunder blade in Lin En's hand. The eyes of the two people fell on each other in the clash of swords with sparks flying everywhere. The next moment, Lin En and Ji Wudao were both pushed back 100 meters by the huge force. Lin En said solemnly, so, this is why you hate us. Ji Wudao laughed and said cruelly, yes, from that moment on, I lost faith in your entire era, but the funny thing is that my mistress still has a glimmer of hope for you, and what's even more ridiculous is that when her memory was gradually suppressed and faded, she actually had sex with you uncivilized people. When he said the last 4 words, Ji Wudao's emotions suddenly got out of control, and the frequency of his attacks on Lin En increased further. He roared, how pathetic and ridiculous. My mistress was such a talented person in that era, but she got married to you uncivilized people, and even died in the hands of you scums in the end. And you dare to call yourselves human. The next moment, he rushed to Lin En, and the sword in his hand was less than an inch away from Lin En's eyebrows. But once you get there, it's hard to take any further. In this boundless silence, Lin An slowly raised his head, looked at the red eyes of Ji Wuodao, who was very close at hand, and said, "Yes, you are indeed right. Some people are not worthy of being called human beings. In my eyes, this era is also the most disgusting and disgusting era." But the next moment, a dazzling purple light burst out of his eyes. "What does this have to do with me?" He walked towards Ji Wuodao step by step. Under the huge pressure, the sword transformed by the divine light in Ji Wuodao's hand collapsed inch by inch. Ji Wuodao's body was also retreating uncontrollably. Lin An said expressionlessly, "You have said so much, what does it have to do with me? Do you think you can use these words to make me soften my heart and not kill you? Or do you just want to vomit your bitterness in front of me before you die?" Lin An said slowly, "I can tell you clearly, even if you kill everyone in the world, I don't care, but if you touch my people, you will die." The next moment, Lin suddenly stretched out his hand and directly shattered his sword blade, and instantly restrained his neck. Ji Wuodao's eyes were instantly bloodshot due to suffocation. He was slowly lifted off the ground by Lin An. He held Lin An's hand tightly and struggled continuously, and his face was gradually covered with pain. Lin An's eyes flashed with cruel light, and he said slowly, "I'm really sorry. I originally had many things I wanted to ask you, but now it seems I have no chance." He slowly turned his head and looked at Dao Yi, who had just been teleported with Ban Meng and was slowly falling from the sky, and said expressionlessly, "Dao Yi, you are very angry. Now I will give you a chance to take revenge. Use the sword in your hand to pierce his heart. Although it is difficult to make up for the trauma he caused you, but it is better than nothing." Dao Yi held the Xuanhuan mother sword in his hand, his eyes instantly turned red. The tragedy in the Taoist sect appeared before his eyes, scene after scene. After coming to this era, it was not easy to have a family, and it was not easy to have a lover. Just like that, being taken away right before your eyes. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 163. Dao Yi suddenly clenched the sword blade in his hand, his eyes turned red, and he said, "Ji Wuodao, I can't understand what you did to me. As the last remaining human race in the fairy era, we have witnessed the collapse of the world and the tragedy of the death of all things. What do you think Master Qingxian said to us, the last remaining people? Already forgotten? She said, our family has been ruined, so we can't watch others suffer the same tragedy as us. No matter which era we finally wake up in, we must do our best to make that era better." He roared and rushed towards Ji Wuodao, his eyes red like peeling blood. Poof! The sword blade in his hand pierced Ji Wuodao's heart straight. Ji Wuodao's pupils suddenly dilated, his breath suddenly lifted at the last moment, and blood rolled along his chest and fell to the ground. Dao Yi's eyes were scarlet, and he said, "This is the meaning of our fairy spirit remnant's existence." Poof! Dao Yi took out the sword, and a tear fell from his scarlet eyes, hitting the sharp blade. Ji Wuodao covered his chest and fell to the ground again and again. He looked at Dao Yi with a scarlet look and said, You are just like my mistress, both, idiots, hopeless." The next moment, his body fell heavily to the ground, and the scarlet blood continued to spread under his body, gradually wetting the entire ground. The light in his eyes quickly dissipated, and his body continued to twitch in his final moments. Suddenly, a drop of moisture flowed out of his distracted eyes. He didn't know whether it was blood or something else. It seemed to fall into the pool of blood with extremely heavy power. The last ray of light in his eyes dissipated. Everyone in the square looked at the scene in horror. This sudden battle frightened everyone. The sword blade in Dao Yi's hand fell to the ground, and he suddenly collapsed on the ground, staring at the ground with empty eyes. "Sir Lin, there is nothing left now," he murmured hollowly. "My family, my lover, my friends, and my tribe are all gone. What I could have had." Lin walked silently to his side, stretched out her hand and put it on his head. But he suddenly realized that he didn't know how to comfort him at all. Wrong. Who was wrong? I'm afraid there will never be an answer. At this moment, one police car after another quickly sped down the street. One soldier after another quickly got out of the car and surrounded the entire square. The Lord of Qingcheng quickly walked out of the police car, raised his head and frowned at the scene taking place in the square. The entire square was in a mess that was destroyed in this battle, and soon, he discovered that the body lying on the square was the high-level town general they had seen falling from the sky before. The strong one. "City Lord, what should we do?" A Grand Master looked solemnly at Lin En and others standing in the center of the square. The Lord of Qingcheng raised his hand and said solemnly, "We will wait and see what happens. We don't know his identity yet, but since he can kill even high-ranking generals, his strength is probably beyond our imagination. Have all the high-level combat forces in the city been mobilized?" The Grand Master nodded and said, "We are on the way here, but..." He looked solemnly at Lin En in the square and said, "I'm afraid they are no match for that man even if they come." In the center of the square, Banmen looked at the swarming law enforcement officers surrounding the square, looked at Lin En's side face, and said, "What about Lin?" Lin En turned around and looked in the direction of the Lord of Qingcheng, shook his head and said, "What else can we do? Tell them our identity and let them clean up." Lin En took out the phone directly from Ban Meng's arms and dialed a number in the address book. Toot. Soon, a mature and steady middle-aged man's voice came over the phone. The voice smiled and said, "Ban Men, how did you know to call your father? Haha, good daughter, where are you now? Have you got that bastard Lin En? Don't worry, haha, although he is 10 years older than you years old, but your father and I are not that kind of unenlightened person. It's just that you are still young, so it's better not to have a closer relationship with him." Lin En said calmly, "I am Lin En." For an instant, the voice on the phone froze in place. I don't know how long it took, but the voice over there coughed and said, "Oh, Lin, haha, I haven't contacted you for a long time, haha." Lin En looked expressionlessly in the direction of the Lord of Qingcheng and said, "I killed someone in Qingcheng, please help me solve it." Chen Daoming was stunned and said, "Are you killing people on the street again?" Lin En said silently, "That's right." The voice on the other end of the phone fell into a long silence, and soon Lin heard a wry smile. "Try to be more careful in the future. Banmen is still young. You lead her to fight with her like this. This makes me, a father, very distressed." Lin En said calmly, "I'll give the phone number to the city lord. You talk to him. I have something else to do. See you later." The person on the phone suddenly said angrily, "Hey. Hello." The next moment, Lin En threw the phone in his hand in the direction of the Lord of Qingcheng, then turned around without thinking, and said, "The phone will be delivered to room 502 of the first hotel later. Let's leave first." The surrounding soldiers were all angry and said, "So rampant. This is simply not looking down upon their law enforcers." At the same time, the Lord of Qingcheng also answered the call. He picked up the phone hesitantly and said, "Hello? Who are you?" A dignified voice came from the other side of the phone. "I am Chen Daoming." In an instant, the Lord of Qingcheng was like holding a hot iron ball. The phone started to beat in his hand with a panicked expression on his face. He quickly grabbed the phone, and the cold sweat on his head flowed down like a waterfall. The surrounding soldiers were shocked to see their city lord standing there upright, holding a mobile phone, nodding and bending, even bending his back to the soles of his feet. Several of his great masters were also shocked when they saw this scene. They said in shock, "City Lord, are you okay?" The Lord of Qing Cheng took a long breath, nodded and bowed repeatedly, looked at the phone that had been hung up, wiped the cold sweat from his head, and said, "I'm fine, withdraw the troops immediately and leave some people to clean up the scene." The great masters said in astonishment, "City Lord, are we just going to let them go?" Before they finished speaking, the Lord of Qing Cheng raised his head with a gloomy face and said, "Do you know who the person on the phone just now was? It was Mr. Chen Daoming. I can see the laws of things." Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 164. As soon as these words came out, the brains of the Grand Masters rang loudly. The Lord of Qing Cheng pointed gloomily in the direction where Lin En and the others left and said, "Do you know who that man and woman are?" A terrible guess instantly came to the minds of the Grand Masters. They were too far away, so they didn't see Lin En and the others' faces just now, but... The Lord of Qing Cheng said gloomily, "Lin En and Ban Meng." As soon as these words came out, the brains of the Grand Masters rang loudly again, and their lips trembled. They trembled and said, how could they come to our Qing Cheng?" The Lord of Qing Cheng took a deep breath and said, "This is not something we are qualified to know. Send someone to clean up the square immediately. Also, this matter should be treated as if it never happened. Don't send anyone to disturb those two, otherwise I can't bear 100 of them." Hotel. Lin En sat cross-legged on the bed, looking at the Xuanhuan mother sword in his hand, frowning slightly. After Dai returned to the hotel and handed him the sword, he stayed in the room alone. Lin En knew that he needed time to calm down. This sudden bad news was a huge blow to him. Lin En had already informed the high-level officials of Qing Cheng to deal with the slaughtered Dao section. Once the Dao sect was exposed, it would surely cause an uproar in Qing Cheng. Lin En looked at the sword and fell into thought. According to Dai, this sword was one of the top 10 spiritual weapons in their era. It was even rumored that this sword was once made by an immortal. But for some reason, after coming to this era, the power of this sword was greatly reduced. If it was really the Xuanhuan mother sword of their period, then the power of this sword would definitely not be just that. But what Lin En valued more was not this point. And whether this sword could also let him permanently engrave the will of law on it like the black umbrella. If it is possible, it proves that it is not necessarily a material problem that he can engrave it permanently. But there are other reasons. Lin En took a deep breath and said to himself, "Anyway, let's try it first." He slowly stretched out his hand and placed it on the cold sword. In an instant, a cold light flashed, and Lin En's hand mobilized the power of the law and slowly engraved it. This time, he engraved a very high-level will of law. Space. That's right, it was the kind of power that could split space that he saw in Chen Daoming's life wheel. There are many ways to use the law of space. He can now only control space splitting and space transmission. But the use of the law of space is obviously more than that. He has not found the most powerful way to use the law of space to construct an inner space or even a small world. A few minutes later, a cold light burst out from the blade in his hand. Success. Lin En opened the Eye of Law and looked deeply at the blade in his hand. From the perspective of the Eye of Law, he engraved two extremely complex wheels on the blade of the sword. Space rip. Space teleport. But whether this is a permanent engraving or not, it will take time to test, but first of all, the power of the sword has been significantly improved compared to before. Lin En turned and looked out the window, and he swung the sword fiercely. In an instant, the sword broke away from his hand and disappeared into the crack of space. The next moment, in the sky hundreds of meters away, a flying bird was instantly turned into countless fragments under the sword. Cut off. And in the next moment, the sword appeared in Lin En's hand again, as if it had never left. Amazing speed. Terrible lethality. It does not cut off the flesh, but directly cuts off the space where your flesh is. Lin En narrowed his eyes and said, if it is really permanently engraved, then this sword, under the blessing of my space will, the power of the sword may have been increased by more than one level. That's right. If this sword that can cut through the void appears in the world, I'm afraid there will be countless people who will fight for it frantically. Take a person's head from tens of millions of meters away, and turn one into 10,000, 100,000, 10 million. With this sword, it is equivalent to having an army. This sword has been upgraded to a world-class artifact at least when Lin En moved his fingers. Lin En said slowly, wait 2 hours. If the will of law still does not dissipate after 2 hours, it proves that permanent engraving can really be completed on this sword. Time passed by minute. Soon, 2 hours passed in the blink of an eye. The next moment, Lin En suddenly opened the eye of law, and purple light instantly flowed in his eyes. The sword slowly floated in front of him, and the 2 wheels on the blade not only did not dissipate, but became even more brilliant. Lin En showed a deep smile on his face, and he said solemnly, sure enough, it has achieved permanent engraving. It seems that my guess is right. It is not a problem of material at all. There is another substance that affects the continuity of the law engraving. So, what is the common point between the black umbrella and this sword? They are both spiritual weapons. They don't belong to this era. The next moment, Lin En suddenly raised his head, and a gleam of light flashed in his eyes. Dao Yun. It was this word, the word heard from Dao Yi. If there is any difference between these 2 weapons and the current weapons, it is that they have all experienced the Dao Yun that was bred by the baptism of time. But what is Dao Yun? Lin En slowly lowered his head and looked deeply at the sword blade. When he engraved the black umbrella before, he didn't pay attention to this problem. He naturally thought that he engraved the will on the material, but now it seems that there should be something between the will of law and the material. Something that does not exist in this era. The next moment, Lin En's pupils suddenly dilated. From the perspective of the law, he saw the deepest part of the 2 space wheels he engraved. On the land that carried them, he saw a layer of powder like pale bone powder. That was. In an instant, a word flashed in his mind. Years. Traces of years, traces of time, could this be the rhyme of Tao? No, perhaps they have a deeper meaning. What constitutes these powders? Is it the law? Lin En looked deeper into the law again. What no one noticed was that blood had faintly oozed from his purple eyes. The next moment, Lin En's brain banged loudly. An indescribable force rushed directly into his mind, causing a shock to their spirits. But at the same time, Lin En finally saw the deepest part of the white powder. He. Lin En covered his bleeding eyes and sat up slowly, with a fanatical smile on his face as if his secret was revealed. So that's it, I thought it was something mysterious, I thought permanent engraving was something that was unattainable. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yitiao Xuanhuan. Chapter 165. That's right. He knew, and at that moment, he finally saw through the reason why he could only make permanent engravings on these spiritual weapons. Those white powders, the so-called traces of time, combined with what Dao Yi said before was the scene of the collapse of laws that he saw at the end of their era. He got it? Those powders are the substances left on these spiritual weapons after the world collapsed and the laws collapsed. If laws are pen and ink, then they are the paper that carries the laws, and they are the most original products of heaven and earth. In a sense, they can be called fragments of the world. Because the only carrier that can permanently carry the laws is the heaven and earth itself. He himself has the ability to carry the laws because he has the will of heaven engraved in his body. And these white powders are most likely the collapse of heaven and earth in the previous era. After that, the fragments left on these spiritual weapons. They survived the end of the period when the rules were missing and the world collapsed. They experienced that dark era, and that era of collapse also left an eternal mark on them. These white powders are the Taoyuan and the imprint of heaven and earth. Lin An looked at the sword in his hand and said to himself, so, does that mean that as long as I cover the material with a layer of this material in advance when inscribing the law, I can achieve permanent engraving? Soon, Lin was engaged in feverish research. His pursuit of knowledge, like his desire for power, seemed to have no end. Heaven and earth, in his understanding, are divided into two parts. The heavenly will in his body symbolizes the all-encompassing universe in a macro sense. The earth roulette symbolizes planets and worlds in the universe. Many people think that heaven and earth are corresponding, but in fact, they are wrong. The earth is actually just one of all things contained by heaven. In other words, earth roulette is completely ready for mass production. But earth roulette, where should I copy it? Lin An came to the window and looked towards the ground. Under the gaze of the eye of law, he looked deeply. In an instant, he saw a hazy roulette wheel, carrying countless laws, spreading from his feet to the end of the earth. Wheel of earth. This is one, but how can I find other earth wheels? Lin slowly raised his head and looked towards the sky. Night has fallen, and the sky is filled with stars. In an instant, Lin An's eyes flashed with bright purple rays of light. He looked up to the sky and laughed, saying, "Isn't that what it is? The sky is full of stardust, and each stardust is actually a world, and each stardust carries a wheel of earth. In other words, the stardust in the sky is his material. He owns the earth wheel of the entire sky." In order to confirm his suspicion, Lin decided to make his first real permanent engraving. He took out the piece of jade that he had collected from his backpack for a long time. Holding it in his hand, the irregular piece of jade seemed to be alive, extremely warm, and exuding a faint light. This piece of jade was found by the insect swarm inside the insect mother after he killed it. This is a material he has never seen before in this era. Although it is not yet clear what it is, even the insect swarm cannot swallow it. It is obvious that it is the most suitable material for his carving. Lin An took a deep breath and sat cross-legged on the ground, with a faint light shining in his eyes. He wants to forge a weapon of his own. He slowly stretched out his hand, with a faint power of law lingering on his fingers, and he began to engrave his first earth wheel on it. Time passed by minute, until late at night. Along with a dazzling light, in Lin An's eyes, an extremely complex roulette slowly appeared on the piece of jade. The earth roulette that belongs to this world. And there was no rejection reaction or any signs of attenuation, which meant that his conjecture was established. Then we can start shaping the second part. Lin An said to himself, first use the will of shaping rules to determine its shape, and then gradually give it the power of other laws. Lin spent the entire night shaping and perfecting the weapon. Until the next day, the sun slowly rose from the distant east. The first ray of light broke into the room. Lin An, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, took a long breath, eyes flashing, and smiled. It's done. In front of him, he saw a long sword that looked like jade but not jade, as pale as bone, lying there quietly. Different from those powerful spiritual weapons, its sword body did not exude any aura of power. It was calm and simple, just like an ordinary stone sword. But under the influence of the eye of law, one can clearly see that one complex wheel after another is engraved on the sword body. This sword was forged by Lin into a sword of absolute power. Spaced here and sharpness give it the ultimate sharpness. Hardness and toughness give it a stronger sword body, while reorganization and healing allow it to recover quickly even after breaking. Then suspension and space jump give it extremely high mobility. But this is not the point, because Lin An wants to make it a sword with extreme power, so he densely engraved hundreds of power wheels on its blade. This further enhances its destructive power. In addition, he engraved more gravity wheels on it. Once activated, the weight of this sword can be increased by tens of millions of times in an instant. The dual combination of gravity and power makes this sword truly a blade of absolute power. Lin En smiled slightly, held the sword, and turned to go out. Dei, use the Xuanhuan Mother Sword to help me test my latest masterpiece. Outside Qingcheng City, Lin En held the pale sword and smiled at Dei standing opposite him. Dei held the Xuanhuan Mother Sword doubtfully, and his eyes fell on the ordinary pale blade in Lin En's hand. He raised his head and hesitated. Instructor Lin En, are you sure you want to conduct the experiment? Lin En nodded, picked up the blade in his hand, and said, I want to see if the sword is what I thought, a sword of absolute power, and the only one that can test its power is the sword in your hand. Xuanhuan Mother Sword. It was a spiritual weapon that could be ranked in the top 10 in that era. Especially after Lin En engraved 2 space wheels on it, its current power is incomparable. Dei nodded, stood up suddenly, looked at Lin En solemnly, and said, Okay, Instructor Lin En. In an instant, a rich spiritual light lingered around his body. Dei read French, and in an instant, with the sword ringing, the Xuanhuan Mother Sword in his hand soared into the sky. The two raised their heads at the same time. The sword blade flew in the air like a dragon, and instantly 1 became 2, 2 became 4, and the number continued to soar. In an instant, the entire sky was covered by the sword formation incarnated by the Xuanhuan Mother Sword. Dei's face changed, and he said, Is this really the Xuanhuan Mother Sword from before? You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. I can see the laws of things. Author, Xuanhuan. Chapter 166. Because he saw that along with the sword blades in the sky, there was a space that was constantly cracking. Those sword blades appeared and disappeared from time to time. They were swimming in the space, making them even more terrifying and unpredictable. Dao Yi turned his head, looked at Lin En's side face, and took a deep breath. He knew that the change in the Xuanhuan Mother Sword must be due to something Lin En had done on the blade. He has clearly felt that the current power of this sword has been improved by more than 1 level based on the original basis. So, what about the sword made by Lord Lin En? Lin En looked at the sky and said, 5 million swords, that's enough. Then he turned to look at the pale sword in his hand. Whether this sword of absolute power could withstand the baptism of these 5 million blades. In an instant, Lin En pulled out the sword blade and a purple light flashed in his eyes. The next moment, he activated all the wheels of law he set on the blade. On the pale sword blade, from a perspective that no one else could see, countless densely packed silk threads instantly lit up with dazzling light, and one wheel after another lit up. This ordinary sword blade underwent earth-shaking changes in an instant. The next moment, Lin En waved the sword in his hand towards the sky. Suddenly there was a huge buzz in the air. Dao's expression suddenly changed. The moment the sword blade was swung out, the space was torn apart and scattered towards the entire sky. The next moment, the rain of swords in the sky made a crisp sound of breaking. The wind howled by. Lin En and Dao Yi stood there, looking at the huge space crack in the sky that had almost split the sky. Countless broken sword blades, like falling birds all over the sky, flew across the sky and fell towards the ground. Dao Yi murmured, God above, what kind of power is this? Lin En lowered his head, looking at the pale sword blade in his hand, and was speechless for a long time. Because the power of this sword was greater than he imagined. Even at the moment when he activated the will of law, the huge gravity made him feel extremely strenuous. It even gave him the feeling that he couldn't completely control it for the first time. Because the one who carries the laws on this sword is not himself, but the earth will. In a sense, this sword is equal to a world. Sonorous. Thousands of sword blades reunited, fell heavily from the sky, and pierced the ground. And under the gaze of Dao Yi and Lin En, with a crisp click, a small crack appeared on the blade of the black and yellow mother sword. Dao Yi was shocked. The Xuanhuan mother sword, cracked. Although this sword is no longer as powerful as it was at the peak of that era due to some unknown reason, the material it is made of is definitely one of the best in the world. But even so, it still couldn't bear the power of the sword in Lin En's hand. Dao Yi took a deep breath and forcibly suppressed the turbulent emotions in his heart. He smiled bitterly and said, "Sir Lin En, did you really spend one night making this sword?" Lin En picked up the pale sword in his hand, nodded and said, "Yes." Dao Yi said bitterly, "I don't know what to say, I just think it's a bit unreal that the sword you made in one night almost broke the Xuanhuan mother sword, which was ranked among the top 10 in our era." He picked up the Xuanhuan mother sword and cried, "But in order to test one divine weapon, it is really good to destroy another divine weapon." Lin En laughed loudly and said, "It's just a sword. I'll repair it later." Repairing spiritual weapons from the previous era. Dao Yi looked at Lin En in shock. It was obvious that Lin En's expression was not joking with him at all. It seems that Chief Lin En really has the strength to repair this sword. This is simply unimaginable. I am really getting more and more confused about how much power Commander Lin En has. Instructor Lin En, you haven't named this sword yet. What do you plan to call it? Dao said with a sudden glance. Lin En looked at the pale blade in his hand, thought for a moment, nodded and said, "Beijian." Dao Yi said dully, Baijian." Lin En said calmly, "If a white sword is not called a white sword, should it be called a black sword?" Dao Yi finally digested this impeccable logic. Indeed, a white sword should be called a white sword, because it is not black. Good name. Dao Yi, what are your plans in the future? After I bury them, I may go back to the ancient land to have a look. I don't know if my people will wake up, but at least, I want to take a look. Lin En looked at the increasingly lonely expression on his face and patted his shoulder. He was very strong. The demise of the Dao sect and the death of his lover must have been a huge blow to him, but at least on the surface, he did not show it, but Lin En knew that he must be in great pain in his heart. Go and have a look. At the same time, Ching Cheng. Ji Wuodao is dead. That's right, 3 days ago, he destroyed the Taoist sect, but was killed by Lin En who came to Ching Cheng the next day. Lin, it's that Lin again. In a hotel in Ching Cheng, 4 gray-haired old men stood in the room. They looked sinister, and each of them had a dark light flashing in his eyes. The old man in the lead had white hair, wrinkles on his face, and a chaotic light in his eyes. If Chen Daoming was here, he would definitely recognize their appearance immediately. The leading old man sat cross-legged on the bed with an expressionless face and said, "After Ji Qingxian died, we thought that the only person in the world who knew the secrets of that era was Ji Wuodao, but now it seems that we are not without a chance." Obviously, the young man named Dao Yi is very likely from the same era as Ji Wuodao. Another old man said solemnly, "Old Hong, you have to know that we don't have much time. When the spiritual energy revived, we were already in our prime. Now 100 years have passed, and we can't advance to world-class magic gods like Chen Daoming and others. Now our blood energy is decreasing year by year, and our lifespan will soon be exhausted. If we don't find a way to continue, I'm afraid we will soon return to the earth." The old man stood up and paced heavily, and the veins on his hands were exposed. Old Hong slowly opened his eyes and said, "Don't worry. As long as we can find the ancient land where they woke up, we will be able to see why they lived to this era. The young man named Dao Yi will be the key to this operation. I can see the laws of things." Author, Yi Tiao Xianyue. Chapter 167. He slowly raised his head, his eyes flashing with a chaotic luster. 100 years have passed in a flash. He still remembered the scene 100 years ago when spiritual energy was revived, the world changed drastically, and the whole world collapsed. At that time, he was just a confused white-collar worker. In that changing world, he really had no ability to fight against it. Until he met a woman who did not belong to this era. He was fortunate enough to be among the first batch of strong men to receive her gift and be able to awaken the will of life. From this, he also gained the ability to gain a foothold in this world. From that time on, they were called saviors and God's chosen people who brought hope to this collapsed world. At that time, he was very willing to accept this honor and fight for the great cause of the human race, even giving his life. But people always change. Especially when you get older and find that no matter how much you practice, you cannot stop the aging of your body and the loss of your blood. People will gradually become less like themselves because of the fear of death. And it just so happened that at that time, the woman they had always regarded as a god lost her power and memory due to inexplicable reasons. As a result, an extremely absurd and sinful idea slowly appeared in their minds. How did you survive the endless years between the two eras without dying? Since you gave us the ability to awaken the will of life, why don't you give us the ability to live forever? A hunt for gods began quietly from that time. He took a deep breath, opened his eyes again, and said slowly, "Pay close attention to the whereabouts of the boy named Dao Yi. We need to find that ancient place through him. We must be the first to uncover the secrets of that era and find a way to survive both eras." Killing intent suddenly flashed in his eyes. "Anyone who dares to hinder us must die." 2 days later, Lin En, Ban Meng, and Dao Yi sat on the jeep. Under the leadership of Dao Yi, they left Qingcheng and headed west. Dao Yi sat in the driver's seat, holding the steering wheel, looking ahead solemnly, and said, "I haven't been back for many years, and I don't know if there are any changes there now, but I have been monitoring the environment around the shelter. As long as there are no major changes in the world, I think there should be it's still the same as before." Lin En sat in the passenger seat, looked out the window and said, "What kind of place is that there? To be able to survive the end of the world, that shelter must not be simple." Dao Yi raised his head, looked at the sky, and said, "Yes, in fact, instead of saying it is a refuge, perhaps there is a more appropriate name for it." Lin turned around and asked, "What?" Dao Yi took a deep breath and said, "Small world." Lin En's heart moved and she said, "Small world." Dao nodded and said, "Yes, the shelter I am in should be regarded as a space separated from our world. The entrance is very secret, but once you step into it, you will find that it is very vast inside. In order to survive the end of the world, people of our time spent a lot of effort to build these shelters. They traveled across the wasteland for 2 days. 2 days later, Dao Yi stopped the car under a barren mountain. He raised his head and looked at the desolate mountain peak, pointed to the mountainside and said, "We are here. This is where I left." Lin En raised his head and said, "Let's go." What they didn't notice was that not long after they set foot on this barren mountain, 4 old men in black robes slowly appeared at the foot of the mountain. "It seems they didn't notice that we were following them," an old man said indifferently. Mr. Ku raised his head, revealing his chaotic eyes, and said, "If we hadn't relied on this aura concealment technique, we wouldn't have been able to escape unscathed after killing that person. If even Chen Daoming couldn't break the technique, how could they be able to break it?" The old man said slowly, "Lin En and the others are also here, how should we deal with them?" Cao Lao narrowed his eyes and said, "Anyone who dares to stand in our way will be killed." The other 3 nodded, their eyes flashing coldly. The next moment, their bodies slowly disappeared into place. 10 minutes later, outside a hidden cave on the mountainside. Dao Yi looked at the deep cave, he suddenly frowned, came to somewhere on the edge of the cave, and said, "When I left here, restrictions were placed on this place, but all these restrictions were lifted." Lin En narrowed his eyes and said, Has someone been here? Dao Yi fell into thinking. After a long time, he suddenly raised his head and said, "No, the restriction is lifted from the inside out, and the secret method of our fairy age is used." His eyes suddenly showed a look of ecstasy, and he breathed quickly. Could it be that my people have woken up like me? The next moment, he ran deeper into the cave. Lin An turned his head and looked half dreamily. The two nodded and quickly followed. I have been advancing in the cave for a very long time. What makes people feel strange is that this cave seems to have no end. If we calculate according to their speed, they have advanced at least dozens of kilometers. This dozens of kilometers should have passed through the entire mountain range. The next moment, Lin An stopped and stretched out his hand to block the steps of Ban Meng and Dao Yi. Dao Yi asked in confusion, "What's wrong?" Lin An raised his head and said, "It seems that someone has set up some kind of ban here. I'm afraid there is no point in continuing like this." The next moment, Lin An opened the Eye of Law. Under the gaze of the Eye of Law, this place changed dramatically in an instant. Lin An saw dense silk-like patterns engraved in the entire cave, which caused the entire cave to distort in space. Thus, this road formed a Mobius loop that never ends. Lin An shouted, "Back off!" The next moment, he suddenly drew out the white sword behind him and slashed forward. There was only a loud tearing sound. The space here was completely split in the middle by Lin An, and the space restriction set here was instantly destroyed by Lin An's sword. And in the gap created by Lin An's splitting of the space, a faint light was emitted. Lin An raised his head, put away the sword, and said, "It should be there, let's go in." The three people nodded immediately, and under Lin An's leadership, they jumped into the gap in an instant. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 168. The intense light instantly obscured their eyes. Dao Yi shook his head and slowly opened his eyes. The next moment, he was stunned by the sight in front of him. They were standing on a huge square at this moment, with tall towers standing one after another, pavilions suspended in mid-air, and mountains swallowed up in the mist, making everything look so unreal. What made him tremble the most was the people on the square wearing the costumes of the previous era. Dao Yi retreated tremblingly and said, here, could it be said that they are all really awake?" Ban Meng was also shocked by the scene that was completely different from other places. This place was like a fairyland in myths and legends, completely different from the flashy world outside. If she couldn't really feel her existence, she would even think she was dreaming. After seeing them, those people in the square all had shocked expressions on their faces. The next moment, bursts of piercing sounds came from the distance. Dozens of men carrying long swords came through the air and instantly surrounded the three of them in the center. "Who are you?" One of them, a man with white eyebrows but who didn't look any older, pulled out his sword and pointed at them and shouted. Lin frowned and slowly pulled out the sword blade. Their language is not Chinese, but another language they have never heard of. At this moment, Dao Yi's voice came from the side. "Uncle Yin. Are you Yin Yongshao, Uncle Yin?" As soon as these words came out, the man was slightly startled, and his eyes fell on the face of Dao Yi who was standing behind Lin En. In an instant, the expression on his face was shocked, and the sword blade in his hand fell to the ground with a clang, saying, "Dao Yi." Dao took a big step forward, looked at the tall man tremblingly, and said, "Is this true? I'm not dreaming. Is Uncle Yin really you? All of you?" He turned his head and looked at everyone in all directions, and said excitedly and incoherently, "Are you all awake?" Half asleep, she looked at the scene in astonishment. She quietly pulled Lin An's arm, but she saw that the expression on Lin An's face was always solemn, and his eyes were narrowed, looking at everyone here. "Lin, what's wrong with you?" Ban Meng asked in a low voice. Lin An narrowed his eyes and said, "It's a little weird here." Ban Meng's heart moved and asked, Is there danger? Lin An shook his head and squinted his eyes. I haven't felt it yet, but this place is very weird. We have to be careful. Banmen nodded, a hint of vigilance appearing in his heart. Dao Yi quickly recognized the man. Everyone here gathered around Dao Yi and asked him various things. Soon, Dao Yi told the people here everything he experienced after waking up. The man named Yin Yongxiao breathed a sigh of relief and said, I thought there was a foreign enemy that broke through the restriction I set outside, but fortunately it was you. To be honest, we just woke up less than a year ago, and we also found the one you left in the gap in the shelter. Restricted, but we still don't know who woke up before us. He took a deep breath, looked at the people around him complicatedly, and said, It seems like they have been sleeping for countless years. Today, less than 1/10 of the tens of thousands of people we set foot in here are left. The others have either turned into ashes over time or never woke up. In fact, we are already lucky among misfortunes. Dao Yi slowly wiped the moisture from the corner of his eyes and said, Anyway, it's good to wake up. Have you been here all this year? Haven't you gone out to see the world? Yin Yongxiao said solemnly, We lack understanding of the outside world. In order to avoid unnecessary disputes, after discussion, we decided to rest here temporarily. After we all recover from the weakness of dormancy, we will leave here and go to the outside world to explore. Dao nodded and said, Yeah, this is indeed the safest way. His eyes lit up, as if he remembered something. He turned around quickly and said, Uncle Yin, let me introduce you to them. They are two friends I met in the outside world, Instructor Lin An and Miss Ban Meng. Yin Yongxiao raised his head, met Lin An's eyes, and then stretched out his hand. Waves like sound transmission sounded in Lin An's mind. Nice to meet you, my name is Yin Yongxiao. This method of communication is direct communication in spirit, without the need for language. Lin said calmly, Lin. The surrounding atmosphere slowly fell into some inexplicable embarrassment. The next moment, Yin Yongxiao's eyes were attracted by Ban Meng standing next to Lin En. After seeing Ban Meng, his expression changed slightly, then he frowned and said, Why does this little girl look familiar? Dao Yi looked at Ban Meng complicatedly, stepped forward, and said in a low voice, Uncle Yin, Miss Ban Meng is the daughter of the great god Qingxian. As soon as these words came out, the faces of everyone around him suddenly changed, showing expressions of shock. Lord Qingxian. A few hours later. In an ethereal palace. Lin leaned against the window, frowning and looking at this dreamlike world. It was completely different from the outside, whether it was architecture, language, clothing, everything had no trace of the world they lived in. At this moment, outside the palace, a girl walked in gently, looked at Lin An softly, and said, Lin. Lin An turned his head and couldn't help but feel something in his heart. I saw Ban Meng wearing a long white dress and her hair was tied up high. She looked absolutely wonderful. Am I good looking? Ban Meng asked softly. Lin An stood up with Bai Jian in his arms, looked her up and down, and said hesitantly, Where did this dress come from? Ban Meng took Lin An's arm with a smile and said, It was given by some sisters here. They said that I resemble a goddess they once believed in. They said that every time that goddess appeared in front of them, she would such a dress. Lin An said slowly, Do you know who the goddess they talk about is? Ban Meng took a deep breath, his eyes were a little lonely, and said in a low voice, My mother? Although all the evidence seems to show that my mother is not a person of our era. She, like Dao Yi, is the human race of fairies has awakened from the ancient land, but... Ban Meng raised his head and said, I still can't connect the mother in my memory with this ancient era. Lin An put his arms around her shoulders and said, It doesn't matter, no matter what your mother is like, you are living in a half-dream of this era, and that's enough. Ban Mengqing smiled lightly, suddenly stood up on her tiptoes, kissed him on the face, and said, "Yes." Lin An touched her hair, took her to the window, looked out the window solemnly, and said, "Banmen, what do you think of this place?" Banmen looked at the solemn expression on his face, and a trace of doubt flashed in his eyes. "It's beautiful." "What's wrong?" From the moment Lin came here until now, the solemn expression on his face has never faded. This was the first time she had seen such an expression on his face for a long time. Lin An said deeply, "Then what if I tell you that everything here is false?" You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. I can see the laws of things. Author, Xuanhuan. Chapter 169. As soon as these words came out, Ban Men was slightly startled. She looked at Lin An's purple eyes, and for a moment she didn't quite understand what he meant, but obviously, she knew that Lin An must have discovered something, so that's why he said this. Ban Men asked doubtfully, "Lin, did you find anything?" Lin An stretched out his hand, slowly placed it on his eyes, and said, "You should know that my eyes can see the laws, that is to say, I can see the essence of this world, and the laws in each person are different, so I can use the difference in one person's laws to see through their cultivation, realm, and abilities." "But do you know what I saw in them?" Ban Men was startled and said, "What?" Lin An's eyes flashed with dazzling purple light and said, "I only saw spirit patterns and souls." As soon as these words came out, Ban Men's expression changed slightly. Lin An turned his head and looked out the window, squinting. "They are different from other people. The laws in their bodies are very simple. Except for the soul, there is no law that symbolizes life. And if a person does not even have life, then it is not a living organism, but what supports their actions is an inscription that I have never seen before in our time. It's not just them, even the surrounding tall buildings, spires, and fairy mountains are all the same. They are all made of that kind of inscription. There is no real matter in their bodies. Everything here is like a dream. None of which are real." Lin looked deeply at the scene outside the window. After he just arrived here, he discovered something unusual about this place. From the perspective of the eye of law, everything is like a dream. All the scenes are made up of silver white lines one after another, and everything around is fake. Ban Men said anxiously, "But how is this possible? If these are all fake, then what exactly are they?" Lin An said deeply, "I don't know, but I think it is necessary to explore the truth here. After Dao Yi left here, some unknown change must have occurred here." Ban Men held his hands and asked worriedly, "Should I tell Dao Yi?" Lin An was silent for a moment and said, "No need for now, let's wait until we find the truth before making a decision. If all this is not malicious to us, in a sense, it may not matter if we continue to maintain this illusion." Ban Meng stared blankly at Lin An's side face. Although there was no expression on his face, she was still vaguely aware of something strange in his heart. She turned her head and looked towards the square along Lin's gaze. "I saw Dai sitting on the square with a sincere smile on his face, laughing and communicating with the people in the square. You can even faintly hear laughter coming from there." Ban Men also had that inexplicable emotion in her heart. She thought that maybe she could understand why Lin An said what she said. If there is no harm, maybe, even if it is an illusion, it will be good. Ban Men raised his head and said, "Lin, what should we do?" Lin An looked out the window and said silently, "Let's set out tonight to see what's going on here. Time flies, late at night. This small world perfectly simulates the normal cycle of day and night and the changing seasons. At night, the entire sky dims, and there are stars hanging in the sky, which looks no different from the outside world. But in fact, those are all deceptions, and nothing here is real. Instructor Lin, are you still awake?" In the palace, Dao Yi, who had already put on the clothes of that era, walked in and saw Lin An leaning against the marble pillars of the palace. He approached him in confusion and asked. Lin An raised his head, glanced at him, and said, "Well, Dao Yi, you look very happy today." Dao Yi grinned, revealing 2 rows of white teeth. He sat down on the floor, crossed his legs and said, "Well, I'm very happy, because I never expected that all my people would wake up in this era. When I left, I actually didn't expect that they would wake up at all. Because at that time, the fairy patterns in the entire refuge had collapsed in many places due to unknown reasons. I even had a hunch that maybe it wouldn't be long before the fairy patterns would disappear forever. After they lost the fairy patterns, after the protection, also." Dao Yi shook his head, with a hearty smile on his face, and said, "It has passed. It is a blessing among misfortunes that they can wake up. I am already very happy." Lin was silent for a moment. "What are your plans? I mean, after that, do you plan to stay here or leave with us?" Dao Yi was startled. He lay down, resting his arms on his pillow, looking at the dome of the palace absently, and murmured, "I haven't thought about this issue yet. Maybe I will stay here for a while, but we will eventually leave, but I don't know if there is any place for us fairy humans in this era, and..." Lin An said silently, "And what?" Dao Yi shook his head and said absent-mindedly, "When I was chatting with them, I found that the power of all the people here has experienced a significant loss. The great powers of our time are now not even as strong as the generals. I don't know what the reason is, but I know. If they go out with their current strength, once they are discovered that we are the human race of the last era, we will probably be. Those who are not of my race must have different hearts." Lin An took a deep breath and raised his head, looking at the sky outside the dome. He remembered the cruel fact he heard from Ji Wuodao. He did not tell Ban Meng what terrible reason was hidden behind her mother's death. "I know." Lin An turned around and said slowly, "Rest early, Dai." Dai grinned and smiled, nodded, and said, "Yeah, Chief Lin An, you too." As he said that, he hummed some folk songs that he had never heard before, and the sound of footsteps gradually disappeared in the depths of the palace. Lin An stood alone in the empty hall, and the wind blowing from the door lifted the ends of his hair. "Come out," Lin An said slowly. Ban Meng walked out from the marble pillar in the corner. She looked in the direction Dai left and said worriedly, "Lin An, we..." Lin An raised her head and looked out the door, saying, "No matter what, before we find out the truth, don't tell Dai the truth for now. Let's go." Lin An strode out the door. Ban Meng took a last look at the dark palace, turned around, and quickly followed. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yi Tiao Xuanhuan. Chapter 170. At the same time, above the square. As the space distorted, 4 black figures slowly appeared on the square. The night was extremely quiet. Kulao slowly pulled down the hood on his head, raised his head, and looked at the world that was completely different from this era. His pupils slowly trembled, and even his breathing was faintly hurried. Could it be that? An old man trembled. This is the ancient land. Is this the place where the secrets have been preserved from the fairy era? The eyes of the 4 old men all showed indescribable expressions of excitement. Finally, hard work pays off. For decades, they have been searching for the secrets of the past era in order to find the art of immortality. Finally, today, they found this place. Mr. Ku said excitedly, "Yes, it seems that the people in the fairy era are not as dead as we thought. They must have used some unknown method to survive 2 eras. As long as we find with that secret, we will definitely be able to find a way to extend our lives." He turned his head suddenly, his eyes gradually becoming ferocious. "Decades of hard work, just look at today. If we miss this opportunity, we will only be greeted by Lois." The other 3 old men all nodded, their eyes flashing with piercing murderous intent. "Who is there?" At this moment, a young man on patrol suddenly fell from the sky, pulled out the long sword from behind, walked towards them, frowned and said, "Which area are you from?" A gust of wind blew by, blowing up the robes of the four old men. And at the next moment, the young man was stunned. The next moment, he only heard a snapping sound from his neck, and his body fell to the ground crookedly. An old man slowly emerged from behind him, looking down at the corpse on the ground indifferently. Old Ku frowned and said, "We need someone to understand the specific situation here. Why did you kill him?" The old man lowered his head, backed away slowly and said, "I was reckless," coaxing the old man. Mr. Ku walked over slowly, looked deeply at the body lying on the ground, narrowed his eyes and said, "Dispose of this body, let's go, find a place first." But before he finished speaking, they suddenly saw a drastic change in the bodies on the ground. Their expressions suddenly changed, and they subconsciously distanced themselves from the corpse. They saw the corpse slowly decompose into countless silver light spots, and slowly disappeared into the air under their gaze. With a snap, a silver-white jade-like fragment fell on the place where the body disappeared. Mr. Ku suddenly frowned and said, "What's going on?" This sudden change was beyond their expectations. Mr. Ku frowned and slowly came to the place where the body disappeared, squatted down, picked up the fragment on the ground, and looked at it carefully. The other three old men also frowned and asked, "What is this?" Mr. Ku looked at it for a moment, squinted his eyes and said, "It seems to be a crystal of some kind of energy, and the power contained in it is something I have never seen before in our world." The next moment, Mr. Ku suddenly crushed the crystal. In an instant, the crystal turned into streams of silvery white light and entered the old man's body. Mr. Ku suddenly took a step back, knelt on the ground and started retching. This sudden change caused the expressions of the other three old men to change. They subconsciously gathered around and said, "Xiao Lao, are you okay?" The wind howled by. After a long time, a low and ferocious laughter came from the mouth of the old man who was kneeling on the ground. He slowly raised his head, looked at the other three old men, and said slowly, "I'm fine, better than I've ever been." Under the gazes of the three old men, he slowly stood up. The next moment, the three old men noticed his changes. They clearly felt that the exhausted blood in the old man's body had been significantly improved at this moment, and even the skin of Artemisia japonica was feeling, at this moment, the vitality of life is faintly revealed. The expressions of the three old men changed drastically, their breathing suddenly became rapid, and they said, "This is..." Ku Lao narrowed his eyes and said, "It seems that even God is looking after us. The power contained in this crystal body is of great benefit to our bodies, although it is not clear whether they can survive this. The reason for an era, but..." He raised his head ferociously and looked at the world, showing a deep smile. "It doesn't matter." At the same time, in another area of this little world, under the night sky, Lin slowly raised his head and looked towards a high mountain located on the edge of this small world. Banmen turned his head and asked, "Did you see anything?" From the perspective of Lin's eye of law, he followed the lines that constituted all these illusions, clarified their context bit by bit, and then followed the context to explore their source. Finally, the eye of law led him to this place. This high mountain on the edge of a small world. "The source is here, let's go." Lin En raised his head, jumped slightly, and headed towards the mountain, and Ban Meng quickly followed. After a while, the two of them reached the top of the mountain. In front of them was a cliff that was too deep to be seen at a glance, and opposite the cliff was the barrier of the small world. Ban Meng looked at the deep cliff, frowned slightly, and said, "Lin En, are you sure this is the place? There is no way here." Lin En stretched out his hand, slowly placed it on his eyeball, and said deeply, "Everything is just a trick to deceive your eyes." In front of the truth, everything you see is false. The next moment, Lin En slowly stepped forward and stepped into the cliff. Ban Meng was immediately shocked to see that the space in front of Lin En suddenly appeared ripples like water flow, and the next moment, his body disappeared there. Ban Meng gritted his teeth, followed Lin En, and stepped towards the cliff. The next moment, Ban Meng opened her eyes, and she was shocked to see that they were in a cave at this moment, and there was a darkness in front of them that spread to the end. "It's really a trick," Ban Meng murmured. Lin En raised his head, drew out the white sword expressionlessly, and said, "Let's go, let's keep moving forward." The next moment, on the walls on both sides of the cave, crystals suddenly lit up one after another. Instantly, the light illuminated the entire cave. At the same time, a weak voice slowly sounded in the minds of Lin En and Ban Meng. "I have been watching you, outsiders.